The cold was a constant companion. Lyra felt it seep through the worn leather of her boots, a damp, aching chill that lived in her bones. It was more than the mountain air, sharp and thin in her lungs. This was a deeper cold, a presence that clung to her like a second skin. She pulled her cloak tighter, her knuckles white. Around her, the world was dying. It always was, near her. The pines, usually defiant against the encroaching winter, were brittle and gray. A ring of decay, of silent suffering, followed her wherever she went. A patch of moss she had passed yesterday, vibrant and green, was now a smear of black sludge on the rock. It was her fault. Her curse. She didn't know where it had come from, this shadow that trailed her. She only knew its effects. Animals gave her a wide berth, their instincts screaming a warning she could feel in the air. Plants withered. The very soil seemed to sour under her feet. For 20 years it had been this way, ever since she was a child, found wandering the woods with no memory and a silence in her heart where a family should have been. The small communities in the valleys had tried at first, but a blight on the crops, a sickness in the livestock, a lingering chill that no fire could banish. They always traced it back to the quiet girl with the haunted eyes. They had cast her out, not with malice, but with the weary fear of people trying to survive. So she had made the high peaks her home. Here, her curse could harm no one. She was a healer, a gatherer of herbs, a skill learned from the one old woman who had shown her pity before she, too, had wasted away. It was a bitter irony. She, who could mend broken bones and soothe fevers with her poultices, was a walking plague. A dead bird lay on the path ahead, its small body stiff, its feathers ruffled by a wind that carried no scent of life. Not pine, not snow, not earth. Just a hollow emptiness. Her stomach clenched. It was getting closer. The something, the invisible horror that dogged her steps, felt more present today, its cold breath on the back of her neck. She hurried her pace, her gaze fixed on the jagged line of the highest peaks. There was a cave system not far from here, a place she could shelter. The wind was picking up, its howl changing from a lament to a shriek. It sliced like claws, driving needles of ice into her cheeks. This was no natural storm. The sky, a placid gray moments ago, was churning with a bruised, violent purple. Snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a thick, blinding sheet that stole the world from her eyes. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the dull ache of her loneliness. She was used to being alone. She was not used to being hunted. The thing that followed her was active, angry, and she was miles from the relative safety of her small hidden hut. She clutched the leather pouch at her belt, the dried herbs within offering no comfort against this supernatural cold. She was a healer, not a witch. She had no defense against the creeping death that was her only inheritance. Her breath plumed, freezing instantly on her lips. Her feet were numb, her steps clumsy. She stumbled, catching herself on the dead limb of a spruce. The bark crumbled to dust in her hand. It's my fault, she thought, the familiar refrain a bitter prayer. All my fault. She was worthless, a vessel of decay. The world would be better off without her. But some stubborn, infuriating piece of her refused to lie down and be consumed. The same piece that had learned to find food in the frozen earth, to set a broken bone, to survive. It pushed her forward, one agonizing step at a time, toward the faint hope of shelter. The entrance to the cave was a dark slash in the white fury of the blizzard. She scrambled inside, collapsing against the rock wall, her body trembling uncontrollably. The wind howled outside, a beast denied its prey. For a moment there was only the sound of her own ragged breathing and the frantic drumming of her heart. The immediate, biting cold of the storm was blunted by the stone, but the other cold, the one that belonged to her, remained. It settled in the small space with her, a silent, waiting predator. She huddled deeper into the cave, trying to chafe some life back into her frozen fingers. The darkness was absolute. She was a healer who brought death, an outcast living in a tomb of rock. The despair was so complete it was almost peaceful. But then she heard it. A sound that did not belong, the soft scrape of a boot on stone, deeper in the darkness ahead. Her blood ran cold, a fear entirely different from the one she lived with. The shadow that followed her was formless. This was a person. No one ever came this high up. No one dared. She froze, trying to melt into the wall. Maybe they would pass. Maybe they hadn't seen her. A light bloomed in the darkness. Not the warm, flickering orange of a torch, but a cool, silver-white glow, emanating from a crystal held in a large, gloved hand. It illuminated a figure so massive, he seemed to consume the narrow passage. He was a giant carved from the mountain itself, broad-shouldered and impossibly tall. A thick cloak of black wolf fur fell from his shoulders, dusted with snow. His face was all harsh angles and sharp lines, beautiful in the way a glacier was beautiful, cold, merciless, and ancient. But it was his eyes that held her. They were not the color of ice, but of molten gold, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. They held no surprise, only a grim, terrible recognition. This was no lost hunter. The power rolling off him was a palpable force, a pressure against her skin. It was authority. It was command. It was the scent of ozone before a lightning strike. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, who this was. The stories told in hushed whispers in the valleys of the Alpha King who ruled from his unassailable fortress, the Granite Peak. A king who hadn't been seen outside his domain in decades. King Valerius. She scrambled back, pressing herself against the rock. I meant no trespass, she whispered, her voice hoarse and thin. The storm. He took a step closer, his golden eyes sweeping over her, not with contempt or anger, but with a strange, unnerving focus, as if he were reading the lines of a map he had been searching for. The silver light glinted off the hilt of a massive sword at his hip. "The storm follows you," he said. His voice was not a shout, but a low rumble, deep as thunder but quiet as snowfall. It was a statement of fact, not an accusation. She flinched as if struck. He knew. Of course, he knew. A king who commanded the wolves and the winds would surely feel the wrongness that clung to her. He would cast her out. Or worse. "I'll leave," she said, trying to push herself to her feet, but her limbs were numb and unresponsive. "As soon as it passes." "No," he said. The single word was absolute, echoing in the confined space. He took another step, and the sheer scale of him was overwhelming. He knelt before her, the movement surprisingly fluid for a man his size. The silver crystal cast his face in sharp relief, shadows clinging to the hollows of his cheeks. He looked weary, a profound exhaustion carved into his features. He reached out a gloved hand, not to seize her, but he stopped just short of touching her face. His gaze was locked on hers. "The shade is close," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "It grows agitated." Shade? Was that what he called it? The formless dread that had haunted her life now had a name. I don't know what it is," she stammered, shame and fear making her voice tremble. "It just follows me." "I know," he said again, and the words held a universe of meaning she couldn't begin to decipher. He finally closed the distance, his fingers brushing against her ice-cold cheek. His touch was not what she expected. Through the thick leather of his glove she expected pressure, possession. Instead, she felt a cold that mirrored her own. A deep, penetrating iciness that seemed to emanate from him, a winter that lived inside his own skin. It wasn't the dead cold of the shade, it was the cold of something fading. For the first time, her fear was pierced by a sliver of confusion. A healer's instinct, buried but not dead, stirred within her. This man, this powerful, terrifying king, was ill. His golden eyes flickered, a momentary dimming, like a fire about to go out. A tremor went through his hand, a fine, barely perceptible shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. He saw the recognition in her eyes, the flicker of professional assessment she couldn't hide. His expression hardened, the moment of weakness gone as quickly as it came. He withdrew his hand. "You will come with me," he stated. It was not a request. He rose to his full, intimidating height, turning his back on her. He expected her to follow. What choice did she have? Die in the cave, consumed by the storm and the shade, or follow the dying king into the heart of his mountain fortress? She pushed herself up, her legs shaking. The stubborn part of her, the survivor, made the choice. She took a hesitant step, then another, following the silver light into the depths of the mountain. She was trading one prison for another, but as she watched the powerful line of his shoulders, the exhaustion he tried so hard to conceal, she felt a strange, unwelcome thought. They were both prisoners. His cage was just grander than hers. The tunnels were ancient and seamless, clearly not man-made. They twisted and turned, sloping ever upward. The air grew warmer, losing its raw edge. The silver light in his hand pulsed with a steady, rhythmic beat, like a second heart. He never looked back, but she knew he was aware of her every stumbling step. She was a healer. She saw sickness in the pallor of his skin under the bronze, in the almost imperceptible catch in his breath. He was powerful, yes, but it was the desperate, brilliant flare of a star about to collapse. The cold she'd felt in his touch was a symptom, a deep, systemic chill that no fire could warm. Her own curse was a shadow that followed. His was a poison working from within. They emerged from the tunnel into a vast cavern, lit by the same glowing crystals embedded in the walls. It was a guard station. Two wolves, massive as ponies, rose to their feet, growling low in their chests. Their eyes, amber and intelligent, were fixed on her. The guards, clad in dark leather and fur, snapped to attention, their faces a mixture of shock and awe at the king's sudden appearance from the forgotten passage. "Your Majesty," one of them breathed, bowing low. His eyes darted to Lyra, full of suspicion. "This woman is with me." Valerius cut him off. His voice was flat, daring any challenge. The wolves fell silent, sinking to their bellies, though their eyes never left her. The air crackled with unspoken questions. Valerius didn't offer any answers. He swept past them, his long strides forcing her into a near jog to keep up. They moved through halls carved from living rock, polished to a dark sheen. Banners bearing the sigil of a snarling wolf's head hung from the walls, stark against the gray stone. This was the heart of his power, a fortress built to withstand a siege for 1,000 years. It felt like a mausoleum. There was no laughter, no music, only the echo of their footsteps and the whisper of drafts. He led her to a set of heavy iron-bound doors, pushing them open into a suite of rooms. They were Spartan but comfortable, dominated by a large hearth where a low fire burned, a bed piled with furs, a table and chairs, and a series of shelves filled with books. It was functional, impersonal. "You will stay here," he commanded, his back to her. He moved to the hearth, staring into the flames. Lyra stood awkwardly in the center of the room, dripping meltwater onto the stone floor. She was a stray brought in from the cold, and she had no idea what her captor wanted. "Why?" she asked, the word escaping before she could stop it. He turned slowly. The firelight played over his face, making the shadows deeper. "Because the thing that follows you is a shade of the unraveling. It is an ancient parasite that feeds on potent life, and its proximity is quickening a process that has been killing me for 200 years. The confession hung in the air, stark and brutal. He didn't dress it in soft words. He laid the truth out like a blade on a whetstone. Her healer's mind latched onto the clinical facts, pushing aside the fear. A parasite, killing him. "Your wolf," she whispered, the diagnosis coming unbidden to her lips. "It's fading. The cold. It's your life force draining away." His golden eyes flared, and for a second, the full, terrifying power of the Alpha King was unleashed in the room. It was a pressure that made her want to fall to her knees. "How do you know that?" he growled. She didn't shrink back. For the first time, she was on solid ground, in the world of symptoms and sickness she understood. "I am a healer," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I see death every day. It follows me. I recognize its handiwork in you." The force receded, his control snapping back into place. The flare of power left him visibly drained. He leaned a hand against the mantle, a subtle tremor running through his arm. The great and terrible Alpha King was holding himself up. The image shattered her fear and replaced it with a surge of unwelcome empathy. He was as trapped as she was. "The shade," she said, thinking aloud. "It doesn't touch me. It withers everything around me, but I am immune." "You are not immune," he corrected, his voice strained. "You are its antithesis, a null heart. Your very presence negates its nature. It cannot feed on you, so it starves in your wake, growing ever more frantic. It's been tethered to your bloodline for generations, waiting for a host it could consume. But you are poison to it." It was too much. Her curse, her shame, the reason for her exile. It was a power, a defense. "I don't understand." "You are the only thing that can sever its connection to me," he said, his voice dropping, losing its edge of command and becoming something raw, something desperate. "I have been searching for signs of you for a century. The dying rings in the forests, the blighted valleys. I knew you were out there, my only hope." So this was it. She wasn't a guest. She wasn't a prisoner. She was a tool. A potential cure he had hunted down. The thought should have angered her, but she was too tired, too hollowed out by the cold and the revelations. She looked at the most powerful man in the world, and all she saw was a patient. A dying man placing his last hope on a cursed girl. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "I want you to live," he said, the words stark. "To stay here, where I can protect you. The closer you are, the more the shade focuses on this fortress, on me. It will accelerate my decline, but it also brings the battle to a ground of my choosing, and it brings my only weapon within reach." He looked at her, and his gaze was a heavy, suffocating weight. "You are the weapon, healer." A servant girl entered silently, carrying a tray of food, thick stew, bread, and mulled wine. She placed it on the table, her eyes downcast, refusing to look at Lyra. She was an anomaly, an outsider brought into the heart of the keep. The girl fled as soon as her task was done. Lyra stared at the food. Her stomach growled, but she couldn't move. She was a weapon, a tool, a cure. She had been given a new name for her curse, but it was still a cage. Valerius watched her, his expression unreadable. "Eat," he commanded, though the word was softer this time. "You are no good to me dead." He turned and walked out of the room, the heavy door closing behind him with a quiet, final click. She was alone, but for the first time, the silence was not empty. It was filled with the presence of the dying king and the weight of his impossible hope. The next few days passed in a blur of wary adjustment. Lyra remained confined to her rooms, but she was not treated like a prisoner. Food arrived regularly. Fresh clothes, simple but warm, were laid out for her. Books from the king's shelves were hers to read, though she found it hard to concentrate. She was a ghost in the machine of the fortress. When she stepped out into the hall, guards would stiffen, their faces blank masks of duty, but their eyes followed her with suspicion. Servants would flatten themselves against the walls to let her pass, their fear a palpable thing. She was the king's secret, a strange woman brought in from the wilderness, and the rumor mill must be churning. Valerius himself was an intermittent and unsettling presence. He would appear without warning, often late at night, a shadow in her doorway. He never stayed long. He would just stand there, watching her, his golden eyes shadowed with pain and exhaustion. They barely spoke. The space between them was filled with the things they both knew but could not say. He was dying, and he believed she was his only chance. One evening he entered and stumbled, catching himself against the doorframe. A wave of dizziness had clearly overcome him. The iron control he maintained was slipping. Before she could think, Lyra was at his side. "You're getting worse," she said, her voice low. It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact. Her hands went to his arm to steady him. Through the fabric of his tunic, his skin was unnaturally cold. The chill was deep, profound. He flinched at her touch but didn't pull away. He was too weak. "The shade," he rasped, his breath catching. "It's tearing at me. It knows you are here." "Let me help," she said, the words instinctive. This, she understood. A body in failure, a life ebbing away. He looked down at her, his expression a conflict of pride and desperation. For a long moment she thought he would refuse, push her away. But the fight was draining out of him. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. She guided him to a chair by the fire, her touch gentle but firm. He sank into it, his massive frame seeming to shrink. She knelt before him, her healer's hands moving with practiced confidence. She felt his pulse at his wrist. It was thready, slow, too slow. "I have herbs," she said, already moving to the small bag she had managed to keep. It contained the remnants of her life's work. "Things to bolster the heart, to warm the blood. It won't cure you, but it might slow it down. It might give you strength." She worked quickly, crushing dried hawthorn berries and ginger root into a small bowl, adding hot water from a kettle left by the fire. The fragrant steam filled the air, a scent of life in the cold, sterile stone room. He watched her every move, his gaze heavy. He had let no one see him this weak for 2 centuries. He had ruled through an aura of untouchable, immortal strength. And now he was letting this strange, cursed woman tend to him like a common invalid. She brought the cup to him. "Drink," she urged softly. His hand trembled as he took it. Their fingers brushed. A jolt like ice against fire passed between them. His eyes widened slightly. Her touch, her very proximity, seemed to create a small pocket of neutrality, a momentary stillness in the war being waged inside him. He drank the infusion, the bitter, earthy taste a shock after years of nothing. He had forgotten what it was like to be tended to be cared for. She didn't retreat. She stayed kneeling before him, her brow furrowed with concentration as she watched for any change. "The cold," she said. "It's like your body is forgetting how to make its own heat. The wolf is your fire, and it's going out." "My father had it," he said, his voice a low rasp, "and his father before him." A slow fading. The shade finds the strongest alpha bloodline and leeches from it over generations, until the line is extinguished. He had never spoken these words aloud to anyone. But you're the last, she realized. The end of a dynasty. The fate of his entire pack rested on his fading life. "Yes," he said, the word heavy with the weight of centuries. In that moment, he was not the Alpha King. He was just Valerius, a man carrying an impossible burden, watching his own life slip through his fingers. Her heart ached for him, a feeling that was dangerous and profound. She was seeing the man behind the crown, the wound he had hidden from the world. A sharp knock on the door made them both start. Valerius straightened instantly, his mask of command slamming back into place, but the effort cost him. "Enter," he called, his voice strained but strong. The door opened to reveal an older man, lean and silver-haired, with clever, watchful eyes. He was dressed in the fine robes of a council member. His gaze took in the scene. The king, looking pale by the fire, and Lyra, kneeling at his feet, and his eyes narrowed. "My lord Calen," Valerius said, his tone flat. "What is it?" "Forgive the intrusion, your majesty," Calen said, his voice smooth as oiled silk. His eyes, however, were on Lyra, cold and assessing. "I was concerned. You missed the evening council session. The scouts have returned. They report a disturbance on the high peaks, a blight that spreads in the storm's wake. They say it follows the woman you brought into the keep." His words were a direct challenge, cloaked in concern. He was testing the waters, seeing how the king would react. "The scouts report what I already know," Valerius said, his voice like chipping stone. "This woman is under my protection. Her purpose here is not a matter for council discussion." Calen's thin lips tightened. "Of course, your majesty, but the pack is restless. They see a stranger in our midst, a carrier of ill omen, and a king who secludes himself. They whisper. They fear." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "They fear you are unwell." It was a dagger, slid expertly between the king's ribs. Calen was not just an advisor, he was a shark, circling, tasting the blood in the water. Lyra felt a surge of protective anger. This man was using her, using the shade, to undermine Valerius. "The king is weary from containing the threat you speak of," Lyra said, her voice clear and cold. She rose to her feet, placing herself subtly between Calen and the king. "A threat he faces alone, while his council whispers." Calen's eyes snapped to her, shocked at her audacity. A nameless stray, speaking to him with such fire. "You would do well to remember your place, witch," he hissed, the polite mask slipping. "Her place is where I deem it to be," Valerius growled, rising from his chair. He swayed for a second, but forced himself to stand tall, a pillar of fury. "And I am deeming it to be here. Now leave us, Calen. Your concern is noted and dismissed." The venom in the king's voice was unmistakable. Calen bowed stiffly, his eyes glittering with malice. "As you command, my king." He backed out of the room, his parting glance at Lyra a silent promise of retribution. The door closed, and the strength seemed to pour out of Valerius. He sank back into the chair, his body racked with a violent tremor. The confrontation had cost him dearly. "He knows," Valerius breathed. "He suspects how weak I am. He will use you to prove it." Lyra looked from the closed door to the dying king. The lines of the battle were becoming clear. It wasn't just her and Valerius against the shade. There was an enemy inside the walls, one who would see them both destroyed to seize power. And she was standing right in the center of the battlefield. "Then let him try," she said, her voice filled with a resolve that surprised her. She was no longer just a cursed outcast. She was the king's weapon. And for the first time in her life, she felt a glimmer of purpose. She would not let that viper destroy this broken, magnificent man. She wouldn't let him. Calen's challenge had changed the atmosphere in the fortress. The whispers grew louder. The suspicion in the eyes of the guards turned to open hostility. Lyra felt like a mouse in a den of wolves, and Calen was stirring them into a frenzy. Valerius grew more reclusive, conserving what little strength he had. The effort of maintaining his facade of power was hollowing him out. He spent more time in her rooms, finding a strange solace in her quiet presence. He would sit by the fire while she read, the silence between them comfortable, a shared truce in their separate wars. she continued her treatments, brewing infusions of warming herbs and creating poultices of rowan and yarrow to place on his chest, trying to fight the internal cold that was consuming him. They were small, almost futile gestures against the centuries-old curse, but they were all she had. And in these moments of care, a fragile intimacy grew. He would watch her hands as she worked, her fingers stained with herbs, moving with a gentle, practiced efficiency. He saw not a witch, but a healer. He saw a strength in her that had nothing to do with magic, the resilience of a wildflower growing in a crack in the stone. One night, as she was changing a poultice on his chest, her fingers brushed against the skin over his heart. It was shockingly cold. He drew a sharp breath, but not from pain. A strange warmth, faint but undeniable, bloomed under her touch, pushing back against the chill. It was her own energy, the nullifying effect of her presence, focused through her touch. They both felt it. He looked up at her, his golden eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning hope. "What was that?" he whispered. I don't know," she stammered, snatching her hand back as if burned. The warmth faded instantly. "Do it again," he commanded, his voice urgent. Hesitantly, she placed her palm flat against his chest. She closed her eyes, focusing not on healing, but simply on being, on the core of stillness within her that the shade could not touch. The warmth returned, stronger this time, a small sun against the winter of his skin. It didn't heal him, but it held the cold at bay. It gave him a moment of peace. A profound sigh escaped his lips, a sound of relief so deep it seemed to come from his very soul. He reached up and covered her hand with his own, holding it there. His hand was large, calloused, but his touch was gentle. "Stay," he murmured. It was a plea, not an order. She did. They stayed like that for a long time, the fire crackling in the hearth, his hand holding hers against his chest. It was the most intimate connection she had ever known, a silent communion of two broken souls finding a moment of respite in each other. She was not just his weapon, she was his anchor, and in that moment, she felt the terrifying, exhilarating fall of her heart. She was coming to care for this dying king far more than she should, but Kaelin would not allow them peace. The threat, when it came, was not a direct attack. It was more insidious. He began to spread stories, twisting the truth into a sharp-edged weapon. The woman the king harbored was not a healer, but a death witch. The blight on the mountain was her magic, a poison she was using to weaken the king, to steal his power. He painted her as a seductress, a parasite who had enchanted their lord. The pack, already unsettled by the king's withdrawal and the unnatural weather, was fertile ground for such fear. They were a people of strength and vitality. The idea of a slow, wasting sickness, a curse, was their greatest horror. Lyra heard the whispers when she dared to walk the halls. Death Witch! King Killer! The fear was curdling into hate. The final blow came during a feast to honor a new moon, a feast Valerius was forced to attend to project an image of strength. He sat on his throne of carved stone, Lyra seated on a small stool at his feet, a position that was neither queen nor servant, and which fueled the rumors further. Kaelin rose, a goblet of wine in his hand, his face a mask of false loyalty. "A toast," he called out, his voice ringing through the great hall. "To the strength of the pack, and to our Alpha King, who has borne a heavy burden for us all." The assembled wolves cheered, raising their goblets. Kaelin's eyes gleamed. But a king's strength is the pack's strength, and when the king ails, the pack sickens. He turned his gaze directly on Lyra. "We have welcomed a viper into our home, a witch who drains our king's vitality, who brings a shadow of death to our mountain. We see the blight on the peaks. We see the pallor on our king's face. We are not blind." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the hall. This was open rebellion, a direct accusation. Valerius gripped the arms of his throne, his knuckles white. He tried to rise, to roar his denial, but a wave of weakness, brought on by the stress and the shade's ever-tightening grip, washed over him. He slumped back, a sheen of cold sweat on his brow. The image was devastating. A king, faltering in the face of a challenge. Kalen smiled, a predator's thin, cruel smile. He had won. He had exposed the king's weakness for all to see. "The law is clear," Kalen declared, his voice booming with authority. "Any who bring a killing curse upon the Alpha must be purged, for the good of the pack." He pointed a finger at Lyra. "Seize the witch." The guards hesitated, their loyalty torn between their weakened king and his powerful, persuasive advisor. The pack elders, their faces grim, watched, their silence a form of consent. They saw only a failing Alpha and a convenient scapegoat. Lyra stood up, her heart pounding. She looked at Valerius, at the agony and fury in his golden eyes. He was trapped in his own failing body, unable to protect her. "No," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "You are wrong. He is not sick because of me. He is sick because of a curse that has plagued his line for centuries. I am not the poison. I am the only cure." "Lies of a cornered witch," Kalen spat. "Guards, do your duty." This time, two of the guards loyal to Kalen moved forward, their hands reaching for her. Suddenly, the great hall plunged into an unnatural cold. The fires in the massive hearths sputtered, their flames turning a sickly blue-black. A profound silence fell, swallowing all sound. The very air grew thick and heavy, like grave dirt. The shade had arrived. Drawn by the peak of emotion, by the king's vulnerability and the crowd's fear, it manifested. It was not a creature of flesh and blood, but a rift in reality, a patch of deeper darkness against the stone walls. It was a void that radiated a soul-crushing despair and a cold that froze the marrow. Tendrils of shadow like grasping, skeletal fingers uncoiled from the central darkness. They ignored everyone else. They flowed across the floor, directly toward the throne, directly toward Valerius. The king gave a choked cry, his body convulsing as the shade's power washed over him. The faint golden light in his eyes extinguished completely, leaving them a dull, lifeless gray. His wolf was dying. Panic erupted. Wolves and guards scrambled back, their pack bravado shattering in the face of this ancient, nameless horror. Kalen stared, his face a mask of triumph and terror. He had not expected this. He had wanted to usurp a weakened king, not unleash an entity that could destroy them all. The shadow tendrils began to wrap around Valerius, not touching his skin, but weaving into his life force, pulling the last vestiges of his power out of him. He was fading before their eyes, his skin turning ashen, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The guards who had been advancing on Lyra forgot her completely, their faces frozen in horror. Lyra saw none of it. She saw only him, Valerius, the man who had shown her his weakness, who had trusted her, whose hand had held hers in the quiet of the night, the man she was falling for, and he was being consumed. A rage unlike anything she had ever known surged through her. It was a white-hot fire that burned away the years of fear, of shame, of worthlessness. The world had called her a curse. Kalen had called her a witch. The shade was trying to take the one person who had seen her as a hope. She would not allow it. She ran forward, placing herself between the throne and the encroaching void. The cold was absolute, a physical force that should have stopped her heart. But it parted around her, a wave breaking against a stone cliff. Her nullification field, the passive defense that had protected her for so long, held firm. "Get away from him!" she snarled, the words a guttural cry torn from her soul. The shade recoiled, not from her words, but from her very presence. The tendrils touching Valerius withered, pulling back as if burned. The entity seemed to focus on her, its non-existent gaze filled with a ravenous hunger and a deep, instinctual hatred. It could not feed on her, and that infuriated it. Kalen, seeing his moment of triumph being stolen by the very woman he sought to destroy, recovered his nerve. "She controls it!" he screamed, his voice shrill with panic. "She is its master! Kill her, and you break its power! Kill her now!" His words broke the spell of terror. The guards, desperate for an enemy they could fight, turned their eyes back to Lyra. If she was the source, she was the target. "For the king!" one of them yelled, raising his sword. He charged, his blade aimed at her back. Lyra heard him coming but didn't turn. Her eyes were locked on Valerius, who was slumped in his throne, barely conscious. A choice, clear and absolute, formed in her mind. Her life for his. It wasn't even a choice. It was a certainty. She would not let him die. She closed her eyes, bracing for the sword's impact. She didn't feel fear. Only a vast, soaring love for the dying king and a defiant rage against the forces that sought to destroy him. She accepted her death, if it meant buying him one more second of life. The sword never landed. As the guard's blade swung toward her, something inside Lyra broke. A dam of ancient power, sealed by a lifetime of fear and self-loathing, shattered. It wasn't a choice to use it. It was an eruption, a survival instinct not for herself, but for him. A wave of pure, colorless energy exploded from her. It was not light or fire or force. It was nothing. A wave of absolute nullification. The charging guard's sword dissolved into dust an inch from her back. He cried out, stumbling backward, his hands empty. The wave expanded, silent and invisible, but its effects were immediate and devastating. It washed over the shade. The entity of pure parasitic energy, the ancient hungry void, had no defense against its perfect opposite. When the wave of unmaking hit it, the shade didn't scream. It simply ceased to be. The tendrils of darkness, the suffocating cold, the soul-deep despair, it all vanished in an instant, like a nightmare upon waking. The darkness that had been a rift in the hall was gone, leaving only plain, solid stone. The wave continued outward. It swept over Kalen and the silken words of power he wove, the political influence he had cultivated for decades, shattered. The compulsion and fear he had stoked in the guards vanished, leaving them blinking in confusion, the bloodlust gone from their eyes. They looked at their drawn swords and at the pale, trembling advisor as if seeing him for the first time. The wave washed over Valerius, the cold that had lived in his bones for 200 years, the tendrils of the shade's curse wrapped around his soul, were not just severed. They were annihilated. A deep, shuddering breath racked his body. Color flooded back into his face, and for the first time in his life, he felt the pure, untainted warmth of his own life force, the fire of his own wolf, rekindling in his chest. The golden light flared in his eyes, no longer flickering and weak, but burning with the intensity of a twin sun's. Lyra stood in the center of the sudden, profound silence. The energy receded, leaving her swaying on her feet, drained but whole. The curse was gone. The shadow that had followed her, that had defined her entire existence, was no more. She was free. She looked at Valerius. He was looking at her, his expression one of utter awe, and a love so profound it stole her breath. He rose from his throne, not with the pained effort of a dying man, but with the fluid, predatory grace of the Alpha King reborn. He walked toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. The entire hall held its breath. He stopped in front of her, his gaze sweeping over her, not as a weapon or a cure, but as the woman who had just saved his soul. He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands. His skin was warm. "Lyra," he breathed, her name a prayer. And then he sank to one knee before her. The Alpha King, in front of his entire court, knelt at the feet of the outcast healer. "You saved me," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer had to hide. "You saved me first," she whispered, tears finally breaking free and tracing paths down her cheeks. "You gave me a place to stand." The spell of silence in the hall finally broke, but it was not with fear or anger. It was a collective gasp of wonder, of understanding. They had not witnessed an act of witchcraft. They had witnessed a miracle. They had seen their king reborn, and they knew, with absolute certainty, who had done it. Kalen, stripped of his influence, his face a mask of ruin, tried to slink away into the crowd. "Seize him," Valerius commanded without looking away from Lyra's face. His voice rang with renewed power, the undisputed command of the Alpha. The guards, their minds clear, moved as one, apprehending the treacherous advisor who looked suddenly small and pathetic. Valerius ignored the commotion. He had eyes only for her. He rose, pulling her gently into his arms. For a moment, they just held each other, a silent confirmation of everything that had passed between them. Her head rested against his chest, and she could feel the strong, steady beat of his heart, the vibrant, living warmth of him. He pulled back just enough to look down at her. The awe in his eyes was mingled with a fierce, protective tenderness. "They called you a curse," he murmured, his thumb brushing away a tear from her cheek. "But they were wrong. You were never the shadow. You were the light that casts it out." He had seen it. From the very beginning, he had seen not her curse, but her power. He had seen her. The self-doubt that had been her constant companion for 20 years, the belief that she was worthless and broken, finally crumbled to dust and blew away. He saw her. He had always seen her. "I was so scared," she confessed, the words a raw whisper. "I know," he said, his voice soft. "So was I. For 200 years I have been alone in the cold, and then you came. And you brought the sun with you." The great hall, the guards, the pack. It all faded away until there were only the two of them. Two damaged souls who had found their other half, their perfect counterbalance. He, the fading fire, and she, the quiet stillness that could shelter his flame. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. The scent of him was no longer just pine and winter, but something vital and alive, the scent of a healthy wolf, of strength, of home. "I'm saying that I love you, Lyra," he said, the words stripped of all artifice, a simple, profound truth spoken into the space between them. "And it's not going to kill me. It's the only thing that ever could have saved me." Tears of joy, of relief, of a love so overwhelming it felt like it could remake the world, streamed down her face. "I love you, Valerius," she answered, her voice choked but certain. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of possession or of gratitude. It was a kiss of equals, of two people who had walked through the darkest of valleys and found each other on the other side. It was a promise, a homecoming, and a beginning, all at once. The entire pack stood as witness, not to the claiming of a prize, but to the union of their reborn king and the woman who was, undeniably, his queen. 3 months later, Lyra stood on a balcony carved from the peak of the mountain, looking out over the sprawling snow-dusted kingdom below. The air was cold, but it was a clean, crisp winter cold, no longer tainted by the creeping dread of the shade. The forests were already beginning to recover, hints of green pushing through the gray. Life was returning. Strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and a familiar warmth enveloped her. Valerius rested his chin on her shoulder, his presence a solid, comforting weight against her back. What does my queen contemplate so fiercely? He murmured, his voice a low rumble against her ear. She smiled, leaning back into his embrace. The word queen no longer felt strange or unearned. It felt like her own skin. The pack had not just accepted her, they revered her. She was the Null Queen, the still heart, who had saved their alpha and cleansed their lands. The whispers that followed her now were of awe, not fear. I was just thinking, she said, that I've never seen the world look so alive. That is because you are seeing it through your own eyes now, he said softly, not through the shadow. He was right. For the first time, she could appreciate the beauty of the world without the filter of her curse. She could feel the sun on her skin without flinching, smell the pines without sensing decay, watch a bird fly without expecting it to fall from the sky. Their life together had settled into a rhythm of quiet joy and shared duty. Kaelin had been exiled, stripped of his name and titles, a punishment Valerius had decreed was more fitting than death. He wanted the pack to heal, not to fracture further over vengeance. Valerius was a different man. The weariness was gone, replaced by a vibrant energy that seemed to light up every room he entered. His wolf was strong, a silent, powerful presence she could feel humming beneath his skin whenever he was near. He laughed now, a deep, rumbling sound that echoed in the stone halls and made her heart soar. The mausoleum had become a home. He turned her in his arms, his golden eyes soft with a love that still made her breath catch. "Are you happy here, Lyra?" "Here?" she said, placing a hand over his heart, feeling its strong, steady beat. "Or here?" A slow smile spread across his face, the kind that was just for her. "Both, I hope." "Yes," she whispered, her own heart full to bursting. "More than I ever thought possible." The broken, lonely healer who believed she was a plague on the world was gone. The dying, isolated king who had forgotten the warmth of the sun was gone. In their place stood a man and a woman who had faced the darkness together and had chosen the light. They had healed each other. He bent his head, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was both familiar and new every time. It was a kiss of domestic warmth, of shared mornings and quiet evenings, of a future that stretched before them, bright and full of promise. There would be other challenges, she knew. Ruling a kingdom was not a simple task. There were rival pacts, political maneuverings, and the long, slow work of undoing the damage Kaelin's fear-mongering had caused. But they would face it all together, from a place of strength, not desperation. As the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered peaks in hues of rose and gold, Lyra knew she had finally found her place. Not just as a queen or a healer or a wielder of a strange and potent power, but as Valerius's love, his partner, his equal. She was home, she was whole, and she was loved. And that, she realized, was the most powerful magic of all.